what is the most amount of magical creatures you've ever come across in a book series? Nerd Nation. So today we are going to talk about the Nickel Brickleby series. And I have to apologize to the readers of the Nickel Brickleby series. I've been a little neglectful in my publishing schedule. The next book to come out is going to be Charn, the third book of the Acadia series. But I haven't forgotten you, and in the way of an apologies, I wanted to put this new book out, which will be released soon, called The Codex of Earthworks. This is a book about the magical races, creatures, and dangers of the world of Earthworks. So, if you haven't heard about Earthworks before in the past, just to give you a little primer about what the premise is, there is a city underneath the earth called Earthworks. And this city is at the center of the earth where magic is still strong. Magic across the globe is dying, right? And part of the catastrophes going on, our young protagonist, Nickel Brickleby, he actually gets drafted into the Dwarven army called the Silver Army. So he gets recalled to Earthworks, and he finds all sorts of creatures there. Since magic is stronger at the core of the earth, there is a huge draw for all these magical creatures. But as you can imagine, all these different cultures and different ideas, sometimes they butt heads, and there can be some conflict there. So one of my ambitions in this book series was I wanted to create cultures of magical races that were so real you felt like you could take a visit to go see the Cenarians or the Thieftians or learn from the Scathians, right? I wanted to not just have these cultural magical races just be peripheral elements, but really take center stage, right? And so I have a ton of magical creatures and magical affinities and magical powers in the Nickel Brickleby series, which is really what I wanted to do and accomplish. Every book, so far there's 5 out, every book highlights a few new magical races, cultures, and locations, and I really try to do a deep dive of those cultures, right? So let's talk about some of those magical creatures and the cultures that surround them. All right, one of the important things to remember as we're talking about Nickel Brickleby series, there is a blight, and the blight is underneath the earth and is overcoming and wiping out the land surrounding the land of the beast, right? So the land of the beast is this huge magical space underneath the earth, the surface of the earth. It's full of meadows and fields and grass and trees and all these things. And there is this nasty blight that is spreading. No one has any cure for it. No one has any idea where it came from. And no one has any idea how to stop it, right? And so Nickel, when he goes down to the center of the earth, he finds this blight, and everyone is scratching their heads and don't know how to solve it. Unfortunately, there is precedent for how this goes sideways. In another world, there was a similar blight that covered the land that ended up eventually wiping out that planet, right? So it's not great that this is going on. And this is one of the mysteries that unravels in the Nickel Brickleby series. All right, so here are just some of the magical types within the Nickel Brickleby series. All magic can be done by any magical race. So all creatures, magical creatures, can do all sorts of magic. But the learning curve is typically steeper. It's harder if your specific magical race doesn't have affinity for that type of magic. And you also need a magical item imbued with magical elements. Many things can be used, such as a bracelet, wand, staff, or even a ring. So let's take dwarves, for example. Dwarves are masters and have affinity for runic magic. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So they could actually do runic magic without any extra preparation or any extra elements, such as a bracelet, wand, staff, or even a ring. But if they wanted to try other types of magic, depending what types of magic it is, it will require an additional item that is usually imbued with the elements that are necessary to create that magic, right? All right. Now there's 2 classes of types of magic users in the City of Earthworks. You've got your warlocks, which are kind of like your warriors, and you have your wizards, right? Your warlocks, they specialize in 2 forms of magic, usually elemental, which is very destructive, and mystic, which it can be destructive, but is very powerful in warfare. The highest rank is the 10th class, starting at 1, going to 10, And then you also have your wizards, right? These are your scholars. They cast a wider net, masters at least of 5 magical disciplines. Highest rank is a 10th class. These are the individuals that are creating new spells. And just like we discovered new technology, these wizards are discovering new spells as things progress. All right, so let's get into it. Part 1, the intelligent races. So let's start with the dwarves, right? So Nickel Brickleby is actually a descendant of a dwarven family. And he, unbeknownst to him, has no idea. And one day he gets summoned to go serve in the Silver Army, which is the army that is occupied and run by the dwarves. So let's talk a little bit about the dwarves, because we find ourselves, the main protagonist, Nickel Brickleby, he is actually descendant from the dwarves. So they use the runic magic, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is, but they're short, stubborn, and sturdy people. And they have skin and bones tougher than a human, and they're often much stronger. They can typically bench over 1,000 pounds. Their eyes are usually uniform brown. They live about 6,000 years. They have a class system. It's just 1st through 4th class, and that's not based on anything in particular besides how much dwarven blood you have in your heritage, right? So if you are a pure-blooded dwarf, you're going to be a 1st class. If you're a much more watered-down version and the dwarf blood is not as strong, you're going to be a 4th class. We find in our story, Nickel is actually a 4th class dwarf. He barely made the cutoff to get recalled to the Silver Army. They're governed by the Cogs of Hern and the 4 Dwarf Lords. The Cogs of Hern are more like an advisory board, right? And the 4 Dwarf Lords, they are really running the show. All right, so let's talk about some runic magic. In another presentation, I'm going to get into a deep dive of more magic. So this is just a very quick primer on how these things work and the type of spells that they can do. But essentially, you draw a symbol of power and say a word of power. And once you do, it activates the rune, and whatever type of rune it is, let's say it's a fire rune, a water rune, a wind rune, a sight rune, it will activate some sort of spell or have some sort of effect, right? And runic magic is essential for building, as they can reinforce structures or program objects with runes for them to act in a very specific way. Now, there's 2 kinds of dwarves that specialize in very advanced runes. The first is the golden calligraphers, and the second is the mech dwarves, and we'll talk about them in a second. But the golden calligraphers are essentially akin to engineers, and they can design runes that are so exact they have a very precise function. So the dimensions of a rune, right? So let's say this is a fire rune. The dimensions of these lines is very important in relation to another line. Now you could have the same symbol, have it really small, or this same symbol, have it really big. The size matters, the potency of the spell. But if you have a line that is too small here, too big there, not quite right here, it will misfire the spell in sometimes a pretty catastrophic way, right? So your rune has to be very exact. And in Tortugan, where the dwarves study, they spend hours, days, weeks learning how to master and draw the correct rune. Now, these dwarves, once they are getting good at making runic magic, they will take metallic discs, they will write runes on them and put them on a rune belt. Now, the rune belts, their purpose is essentially for combat. So they'll have their dwarven armor known as tines, and they will have this rune belt where they will be able to use different spells as needed to have different effects on the battlefield. Let's talk a little bit about mech dwarves. Not all dwarves are fighters, and they use the Timotean. The Timotean is this sort of song that no other creature or race can hear. It's only a dwarf can hear the Timotean. It's kind of the lifeblood. It flows through all dwarves. It gives them energy. And it's actually essential to temper the correct, or to temper armor that has been created by the dwarves with runic symbols or runic magic. So these guys also focus on building, while the golden calligraphers, they usually build weapons. They feel the structure of things the way a musician feels tempo. So they're much more like how you would learn a musical instrument. There's a lot of feeling into it. And as you're shaping runes on, let's say, building parts, they will determine how strong that building is and how it'll stand and how it'll function, right? So they can pretty much program most things to have the desired effect through a complex series of runes that they employ in that structure, in that building. Jason Burntworth, he's one of the protagonists in the story. We find him as describing these guys as a bearded dictionary. And that's not too far off from what they are. All right, here's the most unsettling dwarf type. These are Sumerian dwarves. Now, they are unique in the sense that they have organic armor. This armor's been grown. It is grown from an organic magic metal. And once this armor is made and it is put on, it is difficult, if not impossible, to remove that armor without also killing the dwarf. But the dwarves, the Sumerian dwarves, they are fine with this exchange. Once fully bonded, the armor cannot be removed because the armor heightens their smell and sight to extraordinary degrees. They can detect a lie through scent alone and navigate in total darkness with full confidence. Do not attempt to hide from one. They will find you. All right, let's talk about humans. Now, there's two types of humans, right? There's the piddlers. Piddlers are basically the non-magic folk that live on the earth that have no idea that there's a magical realm just miles under their feet. They have no idea about all these creatures. They're just living their best life they can, and they have no idea. They're known as piddlers, right? It describes the piddlers as ordinary surface humans with no awareness of the magical world beneath them, well-meaning but oblivious. Now, when you have a magic-wielding human, their eyes are going to be blue, and that's a sign of a magic-wielding human. They have a natural affinity for elemental magic. Elemental magic is very destructive, it's very powerful, but it's pretty much based on emotions. Everything from fire to ice to wind, and there's lots of different types of elemental magic, and a lot of times humans will specialize in a few forms. This is much more destructive. It's not really for building, but it is essentially much more geared up for combat. Humans have a class system similar to the dwarves. It's first to fourth class, but instead of basing this on heritage, this is solely based off the type of magic that they practice. If it is a refined form or a form that most people deem that is a better form or a higher class of form, it's a first class. And it goes second, third, fourth, all the way to the fourth class. So fourth class humans are essentially those that participate in magic that is a little bit dirty and that most people think that you shouldn't really be engaging in that sort of magic. All right, let's talk about the Scathians. These guys are awesome. Now, they are humans and they are not born into their abilities. Like most humans, they can have access to elemental powers, but they can also forge a new ability called the Scathian ability. This is forged through years of extreme self-denial without food, sleep, or comfort. So they deprive themselves of these things, and it ends up sharpening their mental acumen. So it's so strong that they gain these abilities, and this is called the Order of the Scathians, and there's a specific order called the Black Creed that we're going to talk about. So once they hone these abilities, they can read thoughts, they can alter memories, they can project mental attacks, and engage in spiritual entities on their own plane, the mental plane. So the membership's pretty exclusive. Very few people can actually do this because it takes tremendous self-discipline. They have to go through the trial of the 10 stripes. The trial begins with, and this is a typo here, the trial begins with surviving a mountaintop in fatal cold. And each step along the way, or each one of the 10 stripes, ends up being much more difficult. It's called the 10 stripes because once they complete it, a magical tattoo appears on your arm. And once you have all 10, you are a full-blooded Scathian. So these guys are so powerful, but there's only so many of them in Earthworks. When two Scathians fight, they will engage in two battles simultaneously, one with the blade, and they train obsessively with hand-to-hand combat with blades. But there will be another combat engaged at the same time that is similar, that is on the plane of the mind. This is known as the Sokotoku, right? So the Scathians' immense power but it takes immense discipline. And if that discipline ebbs, they can lose their abilities of being a Scathian. Next, let's talk about the Thieftians. Now, this is a really fun culture that we really do a deep dive into throughout the book series. So this is actually one of those examples of a fourth class human. Everyone thinks this is kind of a disgusting form of magic. It's potion making. But the Thieftians have cultivated their potion making for a very specific purpose. They usually specialize as thieves or spies, and depending on their orders, sometimes assassinations. So this has garnered them a rough reputation, and they're classified as a fourth class. They exist in a legal gray area in Earthworks because no one wants to make them angry because they'll end up being a victim of being robbed. But at the same time, they rob pretty much everyone, and they're pretty much rob whoever or rob a person if someone is willing to pay a price for them to do it. They also bear the fate of Hish, which is a hereditary vulnerability to Arklin's contagion. Arklin, she lives on the plane of the mind, and she has powerful intellectual and cognitive ability to reach out into our world and affect them. And they are actually very vulnerable to the fate of Hish. So in these bottles, there'll be lots of different spells, such as they can brew liquid air, invisibility, liquid darkness. They can create a potion to melt a lock, a memory potion strong enough to melt through a stone floor, and drink a potion to heighten their senses. So their main abilities come from a lot of their potions. They also have an affinity for a crossbow that they can use as a sling, and they can actually swing between different points that they want to be, almost like I guess you'd say like Indiana Jones whip. So very cool set of humans, and we get to learn a lot more about the Thieftians as the story progresses. And for this segment, this is going to be the last one that we talk about. I'm trying to keep these about 20 minutes each. These are the High Elves. Now, they play an extremely important part in the dynamics of Earthworks. They're tall, slender, and willowy. They have sharp cheekbones, pointed ears, and luminous green eyes. They are wealthy beyond wealthy, owning just about all the companies, buildings, and products in Earthworks and many other cities. This creates an unstable and bitter arrangement. They are the elite of the elite beyond reproach, and they are entitled to success in everything that they do. So here's some examples of their excess. So they essentially own everything, right? But here's some examples of the excess. Now, bear in mind, the elves, the high elves, are an extremely small portion of the population, and yet they exert so much control. They have a tradition of never ordering the same food more than once a year. And if they are seated with multiple elves, who orders first is based on their rank and station. Rank and station is everything amongst the high elves. It dictates who you can talk to, how you treat them, how you greet them, and different opportunities that you can afford. And these families within the elves, they are constantly rising up in rank or falling in grace, depending on what's going on with their family recently. And we see this rise and fall throughout the Nickelbrickleby series. Elves are one of the few creatures that are immortal, which can create quite a problem for inheritance and family relations. So since the next generation of elves never disappears, there's a lot of responsibility and looking to your ancestors that are still alive and still judging you in a very real sense. So it can be a lot of pressure to be an elf. Being a high elf, they are also given the privilege of drinking the Elven Dewer, a magical vitality potion that grants them a glowing appearance, right? So the elves have this glowing appearance, and it's easy to pick out an elf because of when you see them coming, they just exude life and power. And that's all very intentional. All right, I said that was the last one. Let's do one more, right? Because this goes hand in hand. On the other side of that, you have the dark elves, right? Now, the dark elves were born just like any elf, right? But they become dark elves through formal excommunication. Essentially, they're stripped of name, title, possessions, and all official records. The elves, once someone is excommunicated, they essentially blot out their name, everything they've done. They go back in the history books. They remove any record of that person ever existing. And then the elven dwarf fades. The glow goes dark. What remains is indistinguishable from a non-magical human at a glance, except they still have their pointed ears. Once that the drink of Elvendur fades, they look very humanly, right? And so it's very easy to pick out a high elf from a dark elf. So this is a huge shame, or a massive amount of shame has been brought on this person because likely they brought shame to their family, and they've been completely iced out and cut out of their family. But they end up congregating together and creating their own establishment of dark elves. So they have their own aesthetic, they have their own culture, they have their own people. They oftentimes wear dark blue, eyeshadow, black and bronze armor, intricate petroglyphs. And some of these appear significantly older than the standard elf, right? So whereas the other high elves seem like to be ageless, the dark elves seem to be developing a lot more wrinkles and aging along the way. So in the book, we find that there are two paths when this horrible process happens to them. We find that there's two paths. There's the acceptance, process the loss and build forward, or rage. Hatred consumes empathy entirely. So once this pretty much everything gets taken away from them, most of them dedicate their entire lives to becoming masters of war, battle, and mystic magic, right? So they've had everything ripped away, and they a lot of times just dedicate themselves to this very battle-drawn path. All right. They also use mystic magic spells that a high elf wouldn't use, such as Shadow Stride. Because their honor's already gone, it doesn't much matter if they use a spell that is looked down upon. So anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed this first little segment of magical creatures. We will pick up right where we left off on the next series or the next episode and learn a little bit more about the creatures in Earthworks. Anyway, take care, guys, and I'll talk to you later.